All right, hello everyone, and it's my pleasure today to welcome you to the fourth and final event in the New Books in Israel Studies series, sponsored by the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Northwestern University. The series was imagined and then brought into being by Maayan Hillel, a postdoctoral fellow in Israel Studies at the Crown Family Center, with help from visiting assistant professor Sarah Hirschhorn and our tireless administrators Nancy Gelman and Katie Genio, and help as well from Northwestern IT. The Crown Family Center is a hub for research and teaching at Northwestern, and this series reflects and supports our mission. Today, I want to note that we are also beginning our transition back to in-person events, and so I want to welcome specifically those sitting in the room with me, as well as those who are joining us on Zoom. For those of you who are in the Chicago area, I invite you to join us in person on April 11th at 7 o'clock for a conversation with novelist Joshua Cohn, which is part of our annual Crown Speaker Series, and then in May for our annual Klutznick Lecture. You can find more information about both of these and about other events on our website. But now let's turn back to today's event. We are happy to welcome Dr. David Barak Gorodetsky, who is a visiting fellow at the University of Chicago Divinity School on the other side of our fair city. His research interests include political theology, Jewish American history and religious thought, and Israel and world Jewry relations. We are here today to learn more about his book, Judah Magnus, The Prophetic Politics of a Religious Binationalist, which was recently published by JPS and the University of Nebraska Press, and several years ago, an earlier version appeared in Hebrew. His other recent publications include Religion and State in Israel Diaspora Relations, a Social Covenant Approach, which appeared in the journal Israel Studies, and Israel's Secular Religious Cleavage, Post-Secular Genealogies and Remedies, which will be published by Routledge this year. His current book project outlines the history of the Reform movement in Israel, and when he is not teaching at the University of Chicago, he is the director of the Ruderman Program for American Jewish Studies at the University of Haifa and a Shalom Hartman Institute of North America Kogod Center Research Fellow. And with that, I will turn it over to him.
Okay, thank you very much, Claire. Hi, everyone. It's nice to see a few people in person. We've been here for 2 years now, and the first year was kind of Zoomish, and it's nice to be back on the in-person, on a 3D kind of experience. We've been also anticipating this. This is the beginning of the spring semester at the University of Chicago. We've been anticipating the spring, but it doesn't seem to be emerging as early as we are used to back home. Thanks everyone for making this possible. Thanks to Maayan and to Nancy and also to Claire. I'd like to open with a short introduction of the book. I'm most interested in the discussion also with Claire. It's always nice to speak with a person that's actually read the book. And I want to open mostly by outlining just who Magnus was. This is first and foremost a biography. And I will say also that in terms of writing a biography, it always, and I've addressed that in the book, it always raises the questions of, have you been honest enough, or to what extent have you really managed to portray the person? Magnus is a very complex figure. Gershom Scholem said about him that he was the most complex person I've ever met in my life, and it took me 20 years to figure him out. And one of the ways in which he figured him out is something that I will address today, and we'll see that in a minute. Okay, so the book again was published. Oh, sorry, this is, yeah. So this is a book, the book cover. I want to start by a brief biography of Magnus and who Magnus was. So this is a picture of Magnus at the Hebrew University, taken when he was the chancellor of the university, which is maybe his most prolific and well-known public role. So Magnus was born in Oakland, California at 1878, the son of a Hasidic family on his dad's side and a German family on his mother's side, spoke German and a bit of Yiddish. Uh, he was the native boy, the native California boy of the Reform movement, the first Reform rabbi born west of the Mississippi, the golden boy of the Reform movement until about the First World War, where he kind of goes rogue from the movement's perspective. He's ordained as a Reform rabbi at Hebrew Union College in the year 1900. He is an early Zionist. In the year 1896, he publishes a piece called Palestine or Death. Even prior to his rabbinical studies, the Reform movement is not supportive of Zionism at the time, and he is considered one of the early Zionists within the Reform movement. He finishes his PhD in Berlin in Semitic studies. It's not a prolific or extremely important academic work. It's a translation of a treatise from Jewish Arabic by Ibn Aknin, and he leaves Temple Emmanuel. That's in 1902, and then he goes on to develop a rabbinical career in New York City, clashing always with the boards of the temples in which he works on account of his support of Zionism at the time. In 1910, he leaves Temple Emmanuel, his last of three congregations that he works with in New York, essentially founding the conservative movement. He calls upon Temple Emmanuel to leave the Reform movement and to join a new movement, which he calls the unofficial Reform movement. He is at the time very close to Solomon Schechter, who also officiated his own wedding. And Solomon Schechter writes a few weeks after Magnus leaves Temple Emmanuel, Solomon Schechter writes in the Jewish Chronicle in London that Magnus will lead a new movement. It would be a conservative movement because he's a bridge builder. And this part of his kind of identity has to do with his bridge building capability. It doesn't materialize that he becomes the leader of the conservative movement, but it's part of understanding, in many ways, his theology or his religious worldviews. And he goes on later to found an organization which is called the Kehila, which is the first umbrella organization of Jewish institutes in New York. Again, working together with Orthodox, with Reform, and with conservative congregations and notable people. And in 1917, following the US joining the war against Germany in April 1917, he becomes the most prominent Jewish leader of the People's Council for Democracy and Peace, which is the umbrella organization of the pacifist movements and organizations in the US at the time. He speaks at the founding convention. There's policemen with rifles all around him. It's a kind of famous kind of moment in his history. It's very problematic for the Jewish American establishment to have a prominent figure like Magnus support pacifism in 1917. This is the point of time, actually, and I wrote about this also separately, where American Judaism finally, in many ways, converts from its German identity to Americanizing. And in Hebrew Union College, for instance, in Cincinnati, that we all know has its own issues at the moment. At Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati, there is a big poster placed on the walls which says something the likes of, "This is our country, and everyone who does not support that position is not welcome within these walls." Okay, so there is a moment in time. This has to do with the Goethe Deutsche Fair, an event in which a local professor speaks in favor of Germany in a Cincinnati court and is later attacked on that. So Magnus becomes this radical pacifist socialist. He's tied with socialist circles at the time. He supports Eugene Debs, who's then at prison, but he is eventually, in many ways, kicked out of the Jewish American University, which is in many ways the true story of his immigration to Palestine. He moves. He can't really get a job back in the establishment. People don't necessarily want to be engaged with him. And in 1922, he immigrates to Palestine. He's still very much connected to many of the donors and very wealthy families of Temple Emmanuel. He's also married married into one of those families, and in 1922 he immigrates to Palestine, at first jobless. He sits under a tree in Kibbeh and laments, and kind of part of his early prophetic imagination, which will also feature later on. In 1923, he becomes the first chancellor of the Hebrew University, appointed by the Jewish American donors of the university. And this begins a phase of his life in which he is at the same time both what Arthur Goren said, a prophet and a priest, both in terms of Echad Ha'am's terminology, both an administrator and a prophet, you might say, or a radical political thinker. He stays away from politics in the beginning, and even when Brit Shalom is formed, which is an organization that promotes binationalism in Palestine, in the 20s and in the early 30s, he decides not to join Brit Shalom. In 1929, following the outbreaks also of the events at the Western Wall in 1929, he decides to publish his binationalist platform, Like All Nations, which essentially calls for the creation of a binational state in Palestine under British rule and together with the British. One of the claims there, for instance, is that the land is too sacred to be associated with one specific form of nationalism. So that's part of his political theology, which I will be addressing in a minute. In 1930s, he works to promote binationalism in Palestine. It's a challenging time to promote binationalism, but it becomes even more challenging later on. He works together with Ben Gurion. He organizes meetings of Ben Gurion with Musa Alami, which is another important proponent of binationalism at the time. But at the end of the day, that's a sidelined political view within the Zionist establishment. He never has institutional power, which in many ways drives him to assume, one might say, prophetic power. The prophetic politics of speaking truth to power is also the domain of the person that is powerless within the standard political system. That's part of the way his views and his politics work. In 1946, he testifies before the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry. It's swan song, you might say, very well received and heartfelt testimony in favor of binationalism that is eventually translated into a resolution by the Anglo-American Committee of Inquiry to support binationalism for Palestine, but nothing eventually materializes with that. And in 1948, he passes away in October 1948, a few months after the establishment of the State of Israel, after having met with President Truman 9 days before the establishment of the state and trying to convince him not to establish the state and to instead support a binational solution. He meets with Weizmann, first president, who's then going blind already. He meets him in New York, outside of his hotel, and congratulates him for the establishment of the State of Israel. But at the end of his days, he's very pessimistic about what's happening. He's in touch with Hannah Arendt at the time, who is he had formed already another organization called Ichud. She works for the American branch of Ichud, and he writes to her a pessimistic note about 3 weeks before his death, as all hope been lost kind of note. And he dies in many ways heartbroken, away from the land of Israel and away from Jerusalem. Eventually his remains are brought to Jerusalem and he's buried in Sanhedria. So this is like the general outline of his story. And I want to say what I'm focused on in the research and the book and what brought me to that specific focus. So there's a famous book by, I forgot the name, called An Awareness of What is Missing. So I was kind of, I was looking into Magnus's work, and a few things are missing. And what's the things that you note that are missing in the historiography of Magnus? I want to relate to two main things, which are things I tried to address in the book. The first one is the Eurocentric historiography of Brit Shalom. Brit Shalom, most of the scholars of Brit Shalom, including Shalom Watsabi and others, have focused on the German origins of Brit Shalom, Buber's thinking, the Prague Circle's thinking, etc. But Magnus is American, and that affects his views, affects his writing, affects his theology. So my first kind of vantage point was, what is the American aspect of binationalism that Magnus brings forward? This is also to say that there were quite a few other binationalists within the American expats in Jerusalem. Most notable, and this is now under some academic dispute whether Henrietta Szold supported binationalism or not, but for the sake of discussion, let's say that let's put Henrietta Szold in the circle. Israel Jacob Kliegler, who was a scientist that fought malaria and was also part of the binationalist circle, and Jessie Samter, which you can see here in this picture with her partner Leah Berlin and the two kids that they adopted. This is their house in Rehovot that they sold before they moved to Kibbutz Givat Brenner. The kibbutz didn't agree to accept the capitalist money of the house that was sold, and that's another story. But she was also a supporter of binationalists. So it's a trend to see that there are quite a few Jewish American supporters of binationalism at the time. So this is so in terms of the historiographical aspects. The first one is the aspect of the American historiography, or missing American historiography of Brit Shalom. The second one is the fact that quite a few American Jews were binationalists. And the third one is the lack of theology or religion in the historiography of Magnus himself. Quite a few books have been written about Magnus. I found that initially puzzling in the sense that, especially and I've kind of exposed that through the book, Magnus is a theologically driven, religiously motivated, very complex figure in terms of his religious view, torn in many ways by his attempt to find God in history in a time in which it wasn't that easy to find God in history. I don't know if it ever is, but it definitely wasn't easy to find God in history in the interwar period. He describes religious crises, and he is a very deeply moved religious soul. And the question is, how does that translate into a political theology? How does that even affect his political views? How is that translated? So this was essentially, my project was essentially unearthing the political theology of Magnus. And I want to say just a bit about political theology in relation to that. So just to kind of map out the political theology of Magnus, which is essentially what I try to do in my book. So political theology, again, as a discourse in and of itself, is a complex discourse that has to do a lot with the Carl Schmitt's hijacking of the term and Buber's response using the alternative term, which is theopolitics. Political theology in many ways subjects theology to the political as a discourse, as a Schmittian discourse vis-a-vis theopolitics, or what's also called theological politics by other contemporaries at the time. Mostly when I talk about political theology, I'm discussing the way in which religion influences, shapes a political worldview, a reading of history, policy decisions, etc. So it's a more natural in many ways or simple approach to political theology. And within that context, I want to say a few things about Magnus. So what's unique about Magnus's own political theology? What's unique about the American aspects of his political theology? In terms of the American aspects, first of all, the centrality of democracy in his political thinking and the attempt to find religious framings for democracy. This is a discussion in and of itself of the political theology of democracy, but also what I wrote here as American civil nationalism. Magnus comes from a certain form of nationalism that evolves in the US, which is generally a social contract civic form of nationalism, more removed from the kind of folk or more primordial kind of nationalism that predominated the Yishuv at the time. And this is a source of tension for him with the Yishuv, but he has, essentially my claim is that he has a kind of what might be called a weaker messianic tension in relation to nationalism because of his American background and also because of the pragmatism of his worldview, like pragmatism both in the complex context of epistemology and of the meaning of history, which is something I didn't necessarily fully manage to establish, I will say, in the book, but he is influenced by William James, for instance. He reads James, he quotes him, in certain aspects, and he believes in political organization as a form of pragmatism, in the sense that he believes that uh, practical solutions and pragmatic political solutions can be found based on experience, based on creating institutions and on creating settings after which the ideas will follow. So it's first of all about the creation of those institutions, and he has a federalist worldview. He rereads the Federalist Papers in 1947. He talks about federation of two states. He said maybe we should have something which would be the equivalent of a Senate and something that would be the equivalent of a Congress. So it's very obvious to see that the American influences on political thought. On the more theological side, I especially unearth the way in which Reform mission theology influences his thinking. Mission theology, essentially the idea that the Jews have a mission to the world, that mission has to do with morality and with monotheism. It's generally called ethical monotheism under Herman Cohen's terminology. And so that as one motivating factor. And actually, the way in which he translates mission theology into the idea that binationalism is the moral political solution for the situation, because it's a moral demand, because this is what the Jewish conscience, or the Jewish political conscience, can live with. This goes together with a very strong prophetic form of politics. Again, related also to the prophetic theology of the Reform movement in general. This leads to Gershom Scholem claiming that Magnus has a Jeremiah complex. Okay? Jeremiah, in the sense of being the prophet that speaks truth to power, speaks truth to the king or to the kingdom, essentially to Ben Gurion in some translations. But Magnus is also perceived by many of his friends, including Christian friends, that have a lot of both influence on him, and he shares their ideology in many ways. The idea that he is a prophetic kind of voice trying to save Zionism from itself, trying to guarantee a moral solution instead of submitting to power. And that's the kind of language that he takes upon himself, and he's presented by others as this prophetic figure, not always practical, not always dealing with the pragmatics of real-world politics, but offering like a form of theopolitical realism, also together with Buber, in the sense that the claim that eventually moral prophetic politics will prevail in the long run. Even short-term political gains are not worth the price that is entailed. Third aspect is the issue of the sanctity of the land. He talks a lot about the land being sacred, and in that sense, not being subjected to nationalism, meaning nationalism is not the right solution for a land that is so holy. This goes even in modern ideas to the fact that there never was a sufficient political solution for Jerusalem. Jerusalem has always been a tricky issue in political discourse, but I think that demonstrates that in some way. And the last aspect is the issue of universalism and particularism. I don't remember who it was, a scholar that says that if he ever sees another work in Jewish studies about universalism and particularism, he would, I don't know, would ever do. But essentially, it's the idea, the extent to which the American political thought of the Reform movement is universalist in its tendencies vis-a-vis the more particularistic aspects of Zionism, the way in which binationalism actually ties those two together. Binationalism as a form of realizing a quasi-universal kind of solution to the political situation, while at the same time realizing Jewish particularism. So these are like the main aspects of his political theology that I wanted to address. So before we move forward to the discussion, just to sum that up, also in relation to some current, I'd like to read a few of his words, but I'll do that later when we get to Barth. So just in terms of the current discourse, these are two courses I'm currently teaching at the University of Chicago. So I put their posters here for the sake of getting some current affairs feel to this discussion. So part of the context is Magnus, is the question of, can you create a political theology for our time? that has relevance in relation to conflict or resolution, or conflict resolution within the current situation. So that's something that I'm working on, both academically and in a more pragmatic kind of level. But also, there's been a resurgence of the discussion of binationalism recently, especially following the book of Omri Bohm, which is called Haifa Republic. I'm also going back to Haifa. It touches me in many ways, the idea of binationalism being reinstituted in possibly in a city like Haifa. I am often asked, just maybe one note on the other poster. I think a lot of what we can learn from Magnus today relates also to the perception of Israel in the eyes of American Jews. And in many ways, he is the prototype of a certain form of religious moral thinking that's also demonstrated in current sensibilities relating to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But I'm always asked, like, to conclude, would Magnus support binationalism today? Would it necessarily be his platform? Again, it's obviously impossible to know, but my general understanding is that he would support any solution that would be perceived as just from his point of view. So there is a very strong emphasis on the justice in politics. I think he didn't have an understanding of the feasibility of partition. There's many ways in which to understand why he never agreed to partition or thought of partition, essentially a two-state solution, as something that would even be viable. One of the reasons is that he thought that, what would we do with the British? Or actually, what would we do without the British, okay? But I think that in many ways today, it would be safe to say that he would support probably even a two-state solution had he perceived it as a just and egalitarian kind of solution. And he wouldn't necessarily be committed to the current form of binational discourse which prevails today. So by this, I conclude my introduction, and I'm love to go into discussion. Yep.
Okay. So thank you, David, for the overview of the book project and of Magnus himself. I'll let you take a sip of water. I have a lot of notes and questions from the book and from your talk. But I want to start with a little bit of praise for the book, if you don't mind. And I was struck by the way, you quoted Sholem at the beginning of your talk and also in the book, saying that Magnus was the most complex person he'd ever met. I think Sholem was one of the most complex people out there in the history of Jewish intellectuals. So we could do a competition between the two of them. But what comes through in your book is not only Magnus's complexity or the many unexpected turns that he takes in his life and his thinking, but the way that we can understand him best through comparison with others, with other thinkers, with other movements, with other ideas, because he was constantly in conversation with those other thinkers and those other ideas. So if you would allow me to amend, Sholem, from your book, I learned that Magnus is a complex person understood best in contrast and conversation with others. So thank you. That's what I liked most about it. And I would say as well that you do such a great job of putting him very much in his context. He lived through this extraordinarily, what word I want to use. Complex, of course, keeps coming to mind since it's in my mind already, but through really an extraordinary period of time, through the first half of the 20th century. And he was continually reacting to the events of his time and changing in response to them. And the question that in some way, it leaves me with two sets of questions. And one is I have some just sort of follow-up questions on understanding his life as you present it. And then I have questions about what his life story might mean beyond his historical period. And maybe these are categories we could bring to any biography. But in terms of understanding his life in its context, I was struck by the way that he was an ordained Reform rabbi, but you chart the many ways that he moved away from the Reform movement, in particular in his prayer life and in some other ways. And yet you portray him as devoted to mission theology, which is the central theological idea of the Reform movement at that time and even to various degrees until today. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to sort of his ideology, if we could call mission theology that, versus his spiritual life and how those two work together in his lifetime.
Yeah, thanks. It's a great question. It's always a complexity I felt I felt I was kind of unraveling a certain hidden religious life on Magnus on one hand, and part of it was actually hidden. For instance, he used to pray in secret in Orthodox synagogues in Jerusalem and Orthodox synagogues also earlier. He took composer Ernst Bloch to a synagogue like a shtetl, old school Hasidic synagogue in a room somewhere in the Lower East Side, and Ernst Bloch emerges saying, "This was a life-transforming experience for me." So on the one hand, he has this, religious seeking soul. He's especially, there's something about him that he's a seeker on a religious kind of journey, and that emerges in so many ways. But having said that, and again, also his part of the reason he kind of moves to a more conservative view vis-a-vis theologically, vis-a-vis a more reform view, is that he says there's not enough strength in or he says too much milk and not enough, I don't remember what the other, not enough essence essentially in reform theology. He complains that Hebrew Union College doesn't train theologians, but only preachers. So he has this kind of deep seeking on the one hand, but still, having said that, I noticed, and it was also apparent sometimes in the way he references mission theology directly. For instance, in 1917, when he talks about why Stephen Wise leaves the anti-war movement, he says these are people that are essentially betraying mission theology. They're making a mockery out of mission theology, while he himself actually continues to maintain the view. So within the complexity of his personality, I felt that he continued to hold on to the political ideas of mission theology that resonated very strongly for him in terms of his commitment to justice and to prophetic politics, but he maintained a criticism of the reform movement itself and its institutions in that they were not committed enough to that theology. He had the kind of even a restorative kind of approach to mission theology being an authentic ancient form of Jewish politics that the modern reform movement was actually not committed enough to. So that's how I kind of.
So would it be fair to say that for him, mission theology was an authentic Jewish politics, even if it wasn't an authentic Jewish religiosity or a thick enough religiosity?
Yeah, I think in many ways, I'll try to address this through the prophetic lens. I think, mission theology resonated with his kind of prophetic inclination in terms of his own religiosity. It touched upon a certain form of religiosity which is prophetic, but I think that he has concerns that is not really authentic theologically. He feels that, and this goes to what might be understood as certain critiques of current mission theology or current, I would even say, social justice political theology within religious circles, that it's actually motivated by social concerns or by ideological concerns that are actually removed from the theological aspect. And I agree with you that he doesn't find theology there, that it doesn't find enough theology. Even when he speaks specifically about Wise and about himself, he says maybe we are compensating, maybe it's on account of our inability for an actual theological experience or interaction with the divine.
So I want to push and ask you, when you say theology in that last comment, are you really saying God?
I think one of the ways of I addressed the issue of historiography. One of academics, in order to speak about God, they need to use an intermediary term, which is usually theology. They can say religion occasionally, but that translates into a more lived religion sometimes, kind of sociological kind of context. So I use the word theology to say that, you know, Magnus is a religiously devoted person concerned with the question of God. It's not even the theology. Theology, to some extent, already is somewhat Christianized, also understanding of what that means. But yeah, the answer is yes. We are talking about God.
Okay. Sorry, but I think that really sort of fleshes it out a little bit more. So thank you. And I want to back up just a very quick question. You said he had a secret life, right? And I love the image of him, you know, running off to the Hasidic shtibel, bringing guests. How did you find, like, what's the evidence? Where did he hide his secrets?
Yeah. So one of the ways in which I learned more about him was through his contemporaries, and there's a few contemporaries that relate to his religious life. One of them is Gershon Sholem, that says, you know, this was a tormented soul, looking for, you know, seeking for God. There's also Norman Bentwich, who is the first biographer of Magnus, and he was the district attorney of the British Mandate, but he was very close to Magnus. He was himself conservative, one might say, in terms of denomination, and he also leans into those insights. So, and in some of the eulogies, is that how you pronounce that? Following his death, it also features a bit. So I would like, it's mostly, this is also to say something about historiography and the misgivings or the problematics of religion and historiography. This does not really emerge in the historiography of Magnus, but only by going back to his contemporaries and kind of looking at their immediate quotes on Magnus, that level is actually kind of revealed.
Thank you. I have to think for a moment about where I want to go, but I think I want to go to this idea of Magnus as a prophet or following in the prophetic tradition. That's also the framing we often use. Obviously, I mean, I know that you know, but for Martin Buber, and you know, I laugh when I look at the picture of Magnus because Buber, of course, had a beard that he very proudly felt made him look like a prophet, and Magnus, you know, is beardless, so he can't claim that. But how do we end up with these two figures, Magnus and Buber, who can both be understood through the lens of propheticness, or, you know, sort of adopting the model of the prophet from biblical times as a social critic, and yet they had such different politics? Do we have any evidence that they themselves sort of argued about what the prophets meant or who the prophets were? And I'm going to throw you one more, if you don't mind, which is, of course, Heschel, right?
Yeah, I was thinking of Heschel,
you know, flourishes as a social critic after Magnus. But do you see a connection? You know, how would you fit him in if we were to kind of make a triangle among the three of them?
I was thinking of Heschel, first of all, in relation to Joachim Prinz, which is a, you know, equally prophetic Reform rabbi without a beard that appears on the same stages that Heschel appears on and never gets the same public recognition. So it's difficult to be a prophetic, unbearded Reform rabbi. That's why when I was a Reform rabbi, I grew a beard, just to kind of challenge that specific notion. So that's relating to Heschel. Relating to Buber, I think this goes into another form of historiography of Brit Shalom, which is the interest in the academic figures that were binationalist, in the sense that we as scholars are writing and thinking about scholars like ourselves that seemed, and this is where I'll say, seem to have been committed to politics. And this is in many ways, you know, you might say a critique of Buber from a Magnus perspective. They often refer to Magnus, this is done both by Buber and by various other scholars, Hans Kohn, I think, also. Essentially, they address Magnus as the one that restored their faith in politics. Hannah Arendt also uses this word. But the part of the way in which he restores their faith in politics is that he eventually dives into politics and is consumed by politics, whereas they always, including Buber, including Arendt, they always know to step back to the academic perspective and let politics run its course. So in many ways, within that context, Magnus is a less sophisticated also thinker, also in terms of prophetic theology. but it's much more of an activist in terms of realizing prophetic politics. And this also, I think, is a differentiation between me and Buber. And it does appear when they are trying, for instance, to formulate together the ideas of Aor or the yoke as a religious group, a religious political group, then Magnus is more outgoing, active, kind oriented, and Buber retreats to more kind of philosophical notions of the prophetic. So I will say, also in terms of engagement with Arab notables and with Arab leaders, Magnus was much more engaged in the practicalities of binationalism, whereas Buber, I think, stepped back.
So Buber, of course, after the state of Israel is declared as a Jewish state, he
Yeah.
sort of makes kind of a famous statement that he's going to, give up on binational. He's going to accept that it's a Jewish state. It's not a binationalist state. Did Magnus see the establishment of the state? I know he died in
Yeah.
48.
Yeah, so Magnus died a few months after the establishment of the state. And the thing with Magnus is that his life actually freezes a few months after the state is established. It freezes after the assassination of Bernadotte, which is the Swedish mediator, which is a very difficult moment for Magnus. And this is where he kind of, in many ways, loses hope. We don't know what Magnus would have said in the 50s. We know that Buber took the position that was, in many ways, more, this is also the extremist side. There's a zealot side to Magnus. Some people, Ernst Simon writes about this as well, another contemporary. Many dialectical philosophers or thinkers like Buber managed to integrate the establishment of the state into their political theology or into their political views. And Magnus, in many ways, wasn't capable. We don't know what would have happened had he lived more. He was already sick at the time, but I would, to some extent, dare to say that it wasn't a possibility in some historical way. It's not a coincidence that his life ends at a point in which he would not have been able to, I believe, develop an alternative form of political theology.
It's very striking to me that you say that, because that also is kind of a failure of his pragmatism, right? I mean, a pragmatist should be able, as we tell my kids, to roll with the punches, right? And to regroup and to work with the structure that's there. And yet it seems he was so committed to his binationalism that maybe...
I think there's something, in many ways, the pragmatism is, I think, I don't know what's exactly the terms in terms of the alter ego or the other way around, but essentially it's a facade. It's a facade in a way. There's something about this pragmatism that doesn't eventually stand against the very strong religious kind of soul that eventually can't roll back to pragmatism. That's why, and there's a self-sacrificing aspect to it that also has to do with Christian aspects, and with, he speaks about himself as Eved Adonai, as a servant of, which he refers also to Jeremiah, but there's a lot of Christian, he talks about mea culpa, there's a lot of Christian kind of resonances to his, in many ways, self-sacrificing approach towards politics. Yeah.
I have to think.
Yeah, that's okay.
I know you want to talk about Barth and mentioning that he's influenced by Christianity is a wonderful opening to that. I caught another moment in the book where it seems like he's very much in conversation with Christian thinkers, which is his pacifism, especially earlier. So I would like to invite you to sort of go in either direction, but to talk a little bit about the influence on his thinking of interfaith work or simply reading Christian thinkers.
He was very much inspired by first of all, by the social gospel movement, which is essentially a religious movement within the US that also has to do with establishing of communities of faith and kind of doing work in inner cities and that kind of religiosity. It also has to do with religious socialism, which he also shares with Buber and other thinkers. So many of his contemporaries are Christian. When he is in Jerusalem, he continues to read the Christian Century, which is sent to him. This is where he learns about Barth in 1928 and about Barth's book. So that's part of it, in many ways, also of the way in which he never really eventually fitted into the Israeli or Zionist or Yishuv establishment. That related also to his religious identity. which is perceived also by formerly Orthodox people in the Yishuv as inauthentic in many ways, and in many ways, just to say, he has a very strong affinity to he has a very strong affinity to the Quakers, especially around the First World War. He says to Sholem that he would like Judaism and Quakerism to be one. He sends his kids to a Quaker school in upstate New York when he is kind of banished from the city in 1917. So there is a connection, a strong connection there on the Christian side, and an inspiration by Christian thinkers, especially in those early periods, which I think also continues to sustain him when he is later on in the university. So that influence is pretty dominant. There is a specific piece, maybe I'll address that. I'll give some of Magnus's words an echo. So in 1928, he reads, within the Christian Century, he reads a piece by Karl Barth, which really resonates with him both theologically and politically. And I think actually, from a research perspective, I will say that when I found that specific piece, I thought that this is, the vindication of the fact that there is a political theology for Magnus, and there is something that this, for me, was the centerpiece of what I felt could be said about Magnus. But I want to read it's diary entry. I just want to read the first part is actually. There's also the beauty of writing a biography and quoting diary entries and not just sophisticated, elaborate text, because this is him sitting with his wife in the kitchen in Jerusalem, and he says the following. This is in March 1928. I evidently slapped my knee while finishing an article on the theology of Karl Barth. Beatrice, Magnus's wife, asked me why, and I said I could not tell her. Was it because of the past? No. Because of questions like that of peace? Hardly. It is because of present agonies of which I hardly speak, but I must know of them. It is because I am sometimes tortured with the need of an infinite God. You sleep well. Perhaps you could stay up all night and tell me about it. That's it. I don't know how to tell about it. Strange that I should be such a thing as a university administrator. But if you were not then what? If I were altogether free and honest, and I were to follow the glimmer of the gleam that I sometimes have, I would be a voice, perhaps in the wilderness. My father's father and my mother's grandfather talk to me, and I don't listen enough. So this is like the opening text, which is for me a very heartfelt religious disclosure, intimate disclosure also, and usually the kind of things that doesn't pop up in the historiography of the conflict. Let's put it on a wider scale, but it just later goes on to elaborate on Karl Barth's theology, essentially on the idea that, and I quote, there is no way to God, but there is the way from God to us. Man needs God, seeks him, but the search is futile. If man thinks he has found him, it is a Dead Sea apple in his hand, nothingness, further and further away. But let the man opening himself to receive God's influence upon him. That seems to be the essence of the article I was reading. The first part is true. The second has a glimmering of truth for me. For me, this is Magnus's theology in a nutshell. The seeking for God, but the inability to actually create or realize God. And then you must ask yourself, what's the politics of this? And he goes on specifically in this very specific journal entry to kind of take that to its conclusion. And I'll read just maybe one or two more pieces. He says, to whom, to what, our highest loyalties, the state, the family, the nation, the land. All of this is important, but all of it imperfect. Loyalty to the Spirit, if we only dared say God, the only real worthy loyalty. What gives the more perfect freedom, retaining American citizenship or sharing the lot of those with Palestinian citizenship? In sharing this lot, trying to rise above it, while being a pawn in the hands of neither British imperialism nor Arab nationalism, but a pawn, if that it be, of Jewish religion, the higher loyalty. The war has shown the hollowness of church, school, and state. Real loyalty can only be rendered the Spirit, but Spirit is vague. If one only had a real God. So for me, this really demonstrates the complexity. He later goes on to say a few words about how Zionism actually demonstrates this, but this demonstrates the complexity of a religious figure involved, immersed in politics, organizing meetings for Ben Gurion with Palestinian leaders and thinking eventually in the depths of his heart, everything essentially being understood as a religious quest.
So I want to hold that answer. I'm going to ask one more question about his life, and then I want to return to this idea of religion as the higher, God as the highest loyalty, and everything else somewhere beneath it, and yet Zionism as an expression of that. So let's hold that in the parking lot for a moment. But the question about his life that I want to ask is I'd like to hear a little bit more about his wife and his kids, because I found myself thinking, what would it be like to be married to this man, right? He can't keep a job. Every synagogue lets him go. And then I assume his family went with him to Palestine in 1922. That's a huge thing to do. It wasn't something that even American Zionists were doing in any significant numbers. So I'm curious to what degree they were present in his private, in his diary or in his letters, and what we know about them.
I'll start from the end. He has a son of a grandson, or the grandson of a grandson that lives in Israel. I actually, which is a person I actually knew before I had even known about Magnus, because he was a musician, and we actually had him play in an event for another book I was involved in back in 2006 or something, in a house in Jaffa. And it turns out that house is one of 4 houses that Magnus had bought when he was in Palestine. And
so should I add that he
had
to move 4 times within?
And it was more like a real estate probably investment.
Right.
I'll just say one other, in terms of real estate, one other anecdote. He had an orchard in Netanya, and which is where one of his sons ended up also, and he donated the orchard to the municipality of Netanya, and they wanted to call a street after his name. But being such a controversial figure that it is, they didn't want to call a street in Netanya Magnus Street, and indeed there is no Magnus Street in Netanya. So instead, they came up with a brilliant idea in terms of Jewish studies. I don't know if I put it in the book. They called the street Yehuda Nasi. Yehuda Nasi is both a rabbinical figure on the one hand, and also Yehuda the president, because he was the president of the university. So in order not to call the street Magnus Street, they called it Yehuda Nasi. So this is in terms of his commemoration in Israel later on. Most of his family ended up moving back to New York. One of his grandsons is called Rafi. He was a photographer. I think he might still be alive in New York. He had a few daughters which established clothing outlet called Magnus Sisters, which designed bags. If you're interested in a Magnus Sister bags, you will be commemorating Magnus's memory. But I think it's part of the tragedy in many ways of one of his sons was a physician, very notable physician in the Hebrew University hospital. But at the end of the day, his family doesn't stay in Israel. Like, they move back, and that's part of that happens to a few other notable people, including, for instance, Irma Lindheim, who was the head of Hadassah that established En HaShofet. So there is something we know about his family, that they didn't stay in Israel. His sons studied in Areali in Haifa, which was run by a Reform rabbi that was the first head of the school. So that's part of what he maintains. His family schleps around with him. His wife complains about the difficulties of life in Jerusalem at the time, but they are very committed, seem to be, to his cause, and that's in the Jeremiah sense. It's Lechti acharayich bamidbar, like his wife essentially, I would say, Beatrice, followed his difficult journeys.
Okay, thank you. So now I want to go back to the other category of questions of sort of looking beyond Magnus in his context and sort of using him as a jumping off point. So this seems the appropriate moment to share that when I was in graduate school, I spent a summer doing research at the Judah Magnes Museum, which was the Jewish museum in Berkeley, California. It's now part of the University of California system. And the Magnes Museum, I was in the archives, which are the central archives for Jews from the Western United States. And so there, in the Magnes Museum, he's very much an American figure, and as you said, a Californian and all of that. So I'm curious, and you can I think, approach this in multiple ways as, an Israeli who spent a considerable amount of time living in the US. What do we learn from Magnus and his life about being American and about being an American Jew, just in a broad sense?
I think to some extent we learn, I need to think about how to approach this, but I think to some extent we learn about the difficulties or the kind of deep kind of gulf or divide between the Jewish American experience and Israeli Zionist statist experience in relation to, he's one of the few American Zionist leaders that do make immigration to Israel. There are actually very few. It's mostly Henrietta Solden himself. Abba Hillel Silver is offered to be the mayor of Ramat Gan in 1947, which is the head of and it's part of the Republicans Party at the time, so called the Liberalim at the time. And he refuses, and I think in many ways also by looking at Magnus. And he sees in many ways the tragedy of the attempt to translate both Jewish American political politics. Magnus is a tragedy of language. Magnus is a wonderful orator in English. There's descriptions of in 1906 when he's gathering funds for the Kishinev programs, maybe it's 1905. There's descriptions of his oration and women throwing their jewels at his feet because he is such a great speaker and fundraiser, and what happens when he needs to move into Palestine and he speaks not that fluent Hebrew. He has someone that assists him at the beginning, and even his swan song, like his most memorable in many ways speech, is from 1946 when he speaks in English in front of the Anglo-American Committee. So there is something to be learned there. There's a tragic aspect in the attempt to translate political, religious sensibilities from a Jewish American perspective into an Israeli or Zionist perspective at the time. I think that's very prominent. Also, the language aspects relating to that. Magnus was born on the 5th of July, so he used to organize a baseball game every 4th of July in Jerusalem. It's a tradition that didn't hold, but it's also part of his kind of generally what I would say is the loneliness also of the Jewish American pioneers or expats in Palestine at the time, and the way in which it is in many ways a sidelined identity by the cultural establishment. I think that's something that resonates. Also, I think in many ways ends up in the fact that the children of these people do not end up staying in Palestine.
I'm struck by, when he's in Jerusalem, it's that he's not European, right? That's what his Americanness is, a non-Europeanness. And, if we were to fast forward, look at how the conversation has transformed until today, we would oppose Americanness or the Americanness of American Jews with the Israeliness of Israelis, which maybe obscures the influence that American culture has had on Israeli culture, as well as, we can talk about the Europeanness of Israel as well. But I'm at my limit of being able to ask you questions. So I think, are we good? I can keep going? Yeah. Okay, wonderful.
Okay.
So I have more. This is a parallel question, which is, what could we take from Magnus if we were to imagine a different sort of religious Zionism than what we have today, right? Today there is a thing, religious Zionism. It is a certain political position with all sorts of implications. It's associated with, some of the most extreme settlers and things like that. But Magnus had a different religiosity than sort of the orthodoxy that drives religious Zionism. What would a religious Zionism in his model look like today?
I think that's a question that concerned me a lot when I was thinking of the project, and the question essentially of, is there a possibility to construct an alternative religious Zionist political theology which is inspired by the ideas that Magnus champions? I think to some extent there are similar circles that hold similar views within the Israeli religious left, Oz v'Shalom, etc., Lea Shakdiel. There's various people that are involved with that, but I think that something that always seemed to hinder that possibility, both in terms of, I'll say this also as a contemporary person involved in those movements, also the political traction of the reform movement and conservative movements in Israel is, and this was echoed towards Magnus in many ways, the idea that it doesn't seem to hold the same religious gravitas as authentic Orthodox religious Zionism. And there's a lot needs to be done in order to convince Israelis or religious Zionists that this is a form of valid religious Zionism. Part of this has to do with orthodoxy and the relation to halakha and to observance. And part of this has to do with the way in which American thinkers, even within the context of orthodoxy, are not always perceived as front and forward. So it would have been, in many ways, I think, valuable to have that kind of a political theology resonate in the Israeli public sphere. A few things are missing for that. One is, again, the recognition of supposed authenticity of those views as political theology, and the other one is the boots on the ground. I think, had there, this view does hold traction in certain American Olim expat circles in Israel, but that's not enough to create a political party, for the sake of discussion, or to create political gravitas that would really shape the public discourse.
In some ways, I mean, your comment echoes Magnus's own struggles with the reform movement and bridging between sort of authentic, I'm using the word religiosity,
Yeah.
but connection with God, we could call it as well, and more of a political ideology or theology. I'm just going to glance over my notes for a moment. So I have one question, which is, you addressed it a little bit in your initial talk, and maybe it's not a fair question. I'll preface it with that. But binationalism, as you hinted, is in most Zionist circles today kind of a dirty word, and often seen as being equivalent to being a non-Zionist, because in the world we live in today, the assumption is if Israel were to become binational, that would erase either immediately or eventually its Jewish character. And so therefore, if Israel is not a Jewish state, it's not the Zionist project. I find myself as somebody, who works on Buber, often, responding, well, binationalism didn't mean then what it means now, which is what you started to say. But I guess rather than asking, what would Magnus think about Israel today, I'm wondering if you could sort of say, what does a better understanding of Magnus, what new perspectives might it lend us? Not necessarily should we be for a two-state solution, should we be for this, should we be for that, but rather how might we look differently at Zionism, what Zionism could mean, should mean, might be extended to mean today?
I'll address this with a story of a student I have now in the University of Chicago. We attended my course on political theologies of Zionism, and I introduced the main thinkers of Zionism, essentially, starting with, let's say, Herzl and Chad Am. And when we reached the Chad Am, he was like, this is the kind of Zionism I can relate to. This is to say that Magnus was a follower of Chad Am's cultural Zionism, and even when he talks about a binational solution, he's very explicit about the rights of Hebrew language, about a cultural center. So in many ways, he promotes a form of binationalism, which I myself would probably also agree with, which is a form of binationalism that strongly emphasizes the development of Jewish culture, the development of within the context of Jewish language, Jewish time, all the contexts that exist in Israel. And I think that his views are sometimes hijacked again to be understood as a support of a form of binationalism, which is actually closer to a one-state solution, or a binationalism which is essentially saying that this should be the state of all its citizens without any recognition of the cultural, social, and I would even say political uniqueness of the Zionist project. So I think in that sense, um, Magnus can be helpful, I hope, in steering the binational discussion towards what I would say is a more pragmatic or realistic stance of binationalism, to the extent that that is possible within the current political discourse, and that's another discussion. But I would generally emphasize the fact that he talked about a binationalism which contained two distinct cultural centers, and maybe it's a form of binationalism we need to rethink vis-a-vis what, and I'm writing a review of Omri Boehm's book on Haifa Republic, which vis-a-vis a form of binationalism which is adopted today essentially as a claim that the two-state solution is dead, the current situation is morally unsustainable, and therefore essentially binationalism needs to be realized, but essentially at the end of the day, without maintaining those initial kind of cultural Zionist tenets.
It's a binationalism, we might say, that's about the flourishing of both cultures rather than, so often I think today in Zionist circles, binationalism is seen as the suffocation of Jewish culture in particular. So I'm struck by that contrast. I am out of questions.
That's okay.
So are there questions? Yes, please. So.
First of all, thank you for a really fascinating talk and conversation. I was wondering, to what extent Magnus' binationalism worldview was shared by Palestinian intellectuals at that time? I mean, I know that you used to meet Khalil el-Sakakini, which was an intellectual, a Palestinian intellectual, but to what extent these meetings were official, or to what extent these efforts to promote binationalism were actually formal or official?
Yeah, again, I will say again very explicitly that when I started this quest, I was politically a binationalist. I was living in Haifa, in Masada Street. Those of you know what that means, which is like the heart of Arabic-Jewish coexistence in Haifa. And part of my let's say, part of my findings during my research, and again, I did not do original scholarship on this because I don't have access to the language or to the archives, but I've been exploring the research on this, is that generally there was a very low level, if any, support of binationalism in the Palestinian society at the time. In many ways, it's understandable in the sense that Palestinians were a majority and really didn't imagine the need to give up their majority in relation to the political situation. There's a very famous story about this by, as famous as Magnus is, there's a famous story about this that Tom Segev brings about Magnus's meeting with Sakakini in 1941 in the Shepherd Hotel. So Sakakini is Christian, and this also plays into the discussion, and Magnus says to him, first of all, he says, I've been learning Arabic from your books, etc., etc. And then he says, I think if the Christians were not too intimidated by the Muslims, I think he's speaking about the Mufti specifically at the time, he's kind of saying there would have been a chance for a binational solution or something of the sort. And then Sakakini says, I'll tell you a story. And I'll tell you a story about a donkey. And he says a rider of a donkey rides down the road, and then he sees a hitchhiker. And he asks the hitchhiker wants to get on the donkey, and he gets on the donkey. And then the hitchhiker says, how fast is your donkey? And great, and they continue trotting down the road. And then the hitchhiker says, how fast is our donkey? And then the donkey driver says, well, you need to get off. And then he asks why? And he says, because next thing you're going to say, how fast is my donkey? Okay? So this is Sakakini's very straightforward response, essentially saying a very understandable in many ways Palestinian reading of the situation, which is, Zionists or the Zionist establishment came to the land with the eventual idea of taking over and not necessarily agreeing to binationalism, to the idea that there should be any kind of, there's been recently a piece that has been sent to me by Jeff Levine from Emory, about a scholarship about a recent Palestinian thinker that resonated to binationalism at the time, but I will say it wasn't a popular approach at all. And there weren't that many Palestinian parties to that idea. And that's something that I think needs to be taken into account in terms of the looking back at the time and what was practical and what was not.
We should probably note binationalism wasn't popular on the Zionist side either.
Yeah, that's a good,
So,
I'll say,
maybe we're measuring 5 people versus 10 people.
It's, they could all join, one classroom or whatever, but it's essentially, the Anglo-American Committee estimates that that 1/4 of the population the Jewish population supports binationalism, and it's not grounded in anything. There are a few binationalist organizations. One of them is Brit Shalom, which is again, and Ichud, which are mostly elitistic, scholarly circles. Hashomer HaTzair supports binationalism, and that's an important organization, an important political organ. There's Kedma Mizracha, which is kind of a Sephardic form of support of binationalism. Hadassah supports binationalism, and this goes again to this Jewish American aspect of, but all that put together, it's still not a very high or significantly influential support of binationalism on the Jewish side as well. So that's the tragic potential of binationalism. It really didn't have enough support. Just to say one other thing about that, it's a very complex concept to manage on a practical level. It's not an accident that it's not that popular in other places as well. It's always perceived as a morally justified solution, and I can also resonate with that. But it's always the devil is in the details of binationalism in many ways, and how do you create those kind of arrangements?
Thank you. Are there any other questions here? Sure. Okay. Yeah. Just passing the microphone. Scott,
Thank
please.
you very much. I enjoyed your talk. Could I ask you to comment on the enmity between Einstein and Magnus that sprang from their dispute over Hebrew University?
Yeah, I'll just say one of the things I didn't address that much in the book is the Hebrew University controversies. First of all, because a lot has been written about that already, but also it really gets you those of us that are in academia know that it's in our lives so much anyway. So I kind of want to stay a bit away from the academic politics, but it's a bit of a bigger question because actually Einstein and Weizmann were together in opposing Magnus about the question of what would be the identity of the Hebrew University. And in many ways, Magnus won. Magnus won in that Hebrew University became, a bastion of Mad'ei Ruach. I lost the word in English. Of Jewish studies and whereas what Einstein and Weizmann wanted was a scientific institute that would, on the one hand promote science, and on the other hand promote the interests of the practical interests of the issue at the time. So Magnus's vision of the Hebrew University, supported by also the money that he brought in, was part of the way in which he has brought us the Hebrew University as we know today, as a center of study of Jewish scholarship. There were very bitter fights between Magnus and Weizmann and Einstein. Just to say, Weizmann essentially kicked Magnus up to be the president in 1935. He was the chancellor until then, which was actually a more influential position. I will say that Einstein shared some of Magnus's politics. Einstein was a pacifist until the Second World War, as was Magnus. So it wasn't a question of political differences. It really was a question of where the emphasis should be in terms of taking the university forward. And some, I would also add, because we'd address this, European-American, let's say, differences or kind of antagonism of European thinkers vis-a-vis Americans. Gershom Scholem calls Magnus a Jewish Quaker and an American boss. Okay, so that's also part of that kind of discourse.
So with that, I will say thank you to David. Thank you to everybody who is here and who is on Zoom. And please join us for future events.
Thank you very much.